like I'll just kind of introduce the context in which I work with captions at CUNY. At CUNY Television, there's like one department that's like the library and archive, and often in a lot of like public broadcasting environments, the archive is kind of this like optional last step of the process. Like people make a television show, get it onto the internet and onto television, and the archive will be like, oh wait, there was a TV show, and they'll try to get a copy to keep it. But like at CUNY TV, the archive's like in the middle of things. Like the content creators and the producers have to give content to the library and archive, and then we make that content accessible to different groups, like the broadcast unit that puts it on television, the podcasters, those who make DVDs and put it on the web. So we have this central role, and we started broadcasting over the public airwaves about 5 years ago. So we had to start captioning our content for this reason. So the way it worked out is like the captioning position ended up being part of the archive and library team, as a component of our work to help make things accessible. So I'll say like a lot of our motivation to design early workflows were kind of going against like FCC regulations to make sure that we're broadcasting constantly materials with captions unless it has a very specific exemption. And then for all content that we're broadcasting with captions, if we put it onto the web, we have to put it on with the same level of accessibility. So currently we're kind of thinking of like additional captioning regulations and responsibilities like ADA and Title IX, as an educational organization to have like, all of the kind of content and resources we're putting online be accessible to some degree, which potentially means like scaling up, trying to optimize our workflows. So that's kind of why we're here.
Yeah,
how's Virginia?
Same thing, working in a public institution. I'm working, I'm up against not FCC, but Section 508 compliance, which has traditionally not been something that universities have prioritized or devoted resources to very much. So I don't have an active broadcast workflow. I have archival content, mostly analog video, that might be residing, that has come to reside in the archive, right? And some of that might have caption information locked away in it. It's true. So I would say the two main cases, and again, I'm thinking about, some of y'all probably have this if your organizations have tape libraries and haven't trashed them, or if you find yourself going and digitizing historic tape, those may well have caption information, right? So I'm dealing with extracting line 21 information from analog video. So the two main sources of that are actually we do preservation reformatting of commercially produced video sometimes when it's out of print using our either using a fair use argument or Section 108 exemption for libraries and archives. So if we're digitizing a commercial VHS, right, then there's captions on that, and so we can pull those out. We can do a section shortcut. And the other example would be like something if we had broadcast screeners, right? So if we have like a Beta SP tape that was used as a broadcast screener, that may well have caption information on it. And so we have some collections that were created by our university communications and public affairs department that were broadcast on PBS. So those have captions, right? So we shouldn't, when you do preservation reformatting, you need to actually preserve what's there and the functionality of the original object. So we'd not be doing our due diligence if we left that caption info behind.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about some things we've tried. So when we started trying to caption content, we'd be receiving original media from producers, and generally we have like a very open source microservice architecture, so that when we receive a file in, we send it to a list of scripts that create access copies, make checksums, make technical metadata, deliver the derivatives where they need to go. And then we had to try to figure out how to add captioning into the process. But we ended up, initially we were trying to create captions and embed them into the access file that we're using for broadcast. But this ended up being like a very slow process, because sometimes these broadcast files that we would be putting on television would be 30 to 80 gigabytes in size, and the captions are relatively a very tiny amount of the percentage of the content overall. So if we wanted to put the caption inside the file, to embed it, we'd have to drag over this huge file, mux it into place, tie up a computer, hope everything doesn't crash, and then end up with like a new large file that's a revision of a previous one, and upload that. And then after all that work would be done, the producer would say that he had a typo in one of the on-screen graphics, and he'd give us a new version, and we'd have to see if the captions need to be revised or not, and then redo the entire process to package everything together. We realized this was kind of causing an enormous burden and time, use of time for the project. So eventually moved to a place where the workflow of the captions is asynchronous from the workflow for the media. So they can go along independently, and at the end you have two different files, one for audiovisual, one for captions, that can be used in correlation. I mean, I think this is pretty common in web access, that you have a VTT file and audiovisual separate. But I think this separation is a bit more unusual in broadcast environments. Like, we have one server that we put our files on, and it plays them onto TV. And every year I would ask them, can we have captions in a separate file? And they would just say no every year. And then one year they said, okay, we can now do this as a brand new feature. So then we would put a QuickTime file and an SCC caption file onto our server. And it would work okay some of the time, but there were so many bugs in the process. Like, for like on-screen television captions, you can say if they need to like just suddenly appear and disappear, or if they need to move up. Because if somebody's speaking very quickly, like me, you'd just have them move up and scroll by, so you'd have a greater, you'd see the captions on screen for a longer amount of time as they move by, rather than just appear and disappear. But this, if we put in the code to say they roll up, then the caption decoder would just crash, and there would be no more captions for the rest of the show. And then there would be other issues, like if we have too many captions in one line, it would stop working. So it was a lot of just kind of doing all the bug testing and product testing for the broadcast vendor. Whereas some other formats like VTT or other subtitle formats might be more clear open specifications for them that you don't have to pay separate organizations for, and they're a bit more widely used. Whereas broadcast captioning formats tend to, I think, stay in like little isolated silos of technology, so they're not as exposed to like some of the interoperability issues. But yeah, it was a bit discouraging to kind of have, to try to take advantage of this in a broadcast environment, but also be like the tester for it. The format we were using was this broadcast captioning format, SCC, which is just basically a hex dump of the captions with occasional time codes. And the hex dump is similar to ASCII, except one bit is a checksum rather than the first bit is a 0 in ASCII. So if we dump the hex code into like a hex to ASCII reader, we could see every other letter and then garbage for every other letter. So we could we would use that for debugging sometimes, because it was kind of difficult to get an easy workflow to convert from SCC captions into like a more open human readable format. How's you?
Well, so yeah, since we're not a broadcast entity, we kind of started with the idea of using VTT, in part because we're using Avalon Media System at UVA as our content management system, and supports Web VTT. Another thing is okay, so I'm only now getting resources directed to me because people are suddenly caring about a law that they should have been in compliance with for a very long time. But so in making the cell, I'm trying to pitch that captions are time text metadata. So again, I'm working mostly with archival stuff, which I'm under-resourced in two ways. I don't have enough people to do archival description, and I also don't have enough stuff for captions. So I really need to kill two birds with one stone there, and be thinking about, okay, if we're gonna if we're legally mandated to have a 99% accurate transcript, well then we need to severely ratchet down the labor that a cataloger is doing. Yeah.
So when I think back as to when we started captioning, and we were kind of tying the design of our workflow to things that were used in broadcast communities, I ended up talking to different public broadcasting organizations about how they caption, and kind of picking and choosing from their methods. But I find that nowadays, when you're working in video, there are you can pull resources from the broadcast community, or from the web community. and there's sort of different sets of resources, and there are different communities that are like slowly colliding in some ways, but kind of operate quite differently. And I think if it was being re-examined now, I'd look more towards like what's accessible for like web subtitling, and trying to adapt that to create an access file that would be suitable for broadcasting, but to focus on like web captioning resources development.
I'm going to interrupt Dave to say, so AV archives are already in kind of a weird place where so our main professional organization is already kind of a bizarre split between broadcast and industry, and then libraries and archives that have audiovisual resources in them. And one case that's being made is that so the standards we are likely to inherit are those of organizations like SMPTE, who really don't reflect our values or requirements at all. This is one place where Dave's standardization work has been really inspiring. So like archives and libraries shouldn't really frequently don't have the resources to actually use those standards. First of all, they're not free, they're not open. The standardization process very, very rarely has people who are doing similar work at the table. And so Dave's been a really good voice in our professional community to take that standardization effort to places like Internet Engineering Task Force, and it's a good admission that so we have this large broadcast influence, but really the web is where video is actually consumed as opposed to through broadcast channels, whatever those might be.
Yeah, I mean, and Steven's great at that too. He's always trolling the right people on Twitter. I wanted to say about current workflows. We end up kind of realizing that we can't really use a single vendor for this issue to collaborate with. I'm having a discussion with another department in CUNY that's trying to identify a single company to just outsource the entire problem of captioning and accessibility, and trying to say that it's not necessarily the best strategy to just have one tool to address the issue. We end up relying on two services. One is Pop-Up Archive that presented earlier, which is kind of a speech-to-text, the computer does it service. And then we use another service that is more used by broadcasters, but it's a service where an audio line is sent over a phone to a human captioner who in real time would send back a text stream that would be used as captions. So this takes a lot of scheduling, and for some reason it's a lot less expensive if we just send a half-hour program for them and live and have it come back than if we sent them a half-hour audio file and said, on your own time, do this. For sometimes somehow the real-time cost is a lot less than if they use their own schedule for it. And then we also hired a full-time person to kind of coordinate this and liaise between the content creators and the needs for different types of distribution. So she ends up kind of delegating different assignments to use different services depending on the level of quality we aspire to, the amount of time we have to manually intervene. But I will say, even having these speech-to-text tools does not give the full picture of what we need for accessibility, because even though you're transforming the speech into text, there's a lot of things that can happen in audiovisual media that has things that are not speech but you need to communicate. So if you see a scene of a conversation and everyone's talking and then they run away really quickly, it's helpful to know that there's an off-screen train whistle or a gunshot, or and if you see somebody just jamming his, bobbing his head and loving it, it's good to see that there's music playing, and that's why he's in such a relaxed, good mood. And speech to text alone doesn't necessarily communicate the whole environment that you could be aware of if you could hear the audio. Additionally, we need to kind of delineate who's speaking when, and if there's a group of people on screen, it's good to give some sort of visual cue of who's speaking by listing their name, or when we saw in C-SPAN, they put those 3 carets. Those are often an indicator that the speaker has transitioned from one person to another. So it ends up being a mix of our own internal work and then coordinated outsource work to kind of create the entire thing. On the subject as to why I get better, I feel nowadays, and this conference is addressing it a lot, there's a lot more awareness on the extra utility of using this caption data. when I was looking around at other public broadcasters and like how their workflows are going, there were a couple that just outsourced captioning entirely to an organization that would just live caption for 24 hours. So even if the station is playing the same show 4 times in one day, they would just pay for it to get captioned every single time, and they wouldn't end up with anything at the end except like some awareness that the FCC would be okay with what they're doing. But it ends up creating something that's not really usable, that doesn't bring additional value. I feel like at this time those workflows are probably forced to be revised now that the FCC requires broadcast captioned content to be online with the same level of accessibility. But this stuff also helps facilitate search and accessibility. Currently at CUNY we have a project to kind of redesign our website, and we're trying to integrate a lot of concepts about accessibility and search into it using the captioning data we have. Yeah. How about you? Why get better?
Well, so yeah, one reason I'm curious, or I was curious to attend this meetup is that, especially compared to cultural heritage orgs, broadcast entities tend to have like much more throughput and also more deadlines. Like they get more done or are made to get more done. So right now I'm still in early days where I'm basically just speccing out the effort required so that I can articulate to someone on high like what labor might actually be, like what combination of labor and tools is actually realistic for us. So I've also been experimenting with Pop-Up Archive for at least 9 months or so. But I have kind of the same thing of like, okay, if I was to devote like those transcripts need enrichment, and who's going to do that work, and what tools are they going to use, right? Is that something that I sit a bunch of student workers down in front of? Do they need to be doing, like, what's the best tool for them to then actually clean that stuff up? So it's kind of just a survey of what's out there right now. Yep.
This is kind of our last topic, and we touched on this a bit already. In the environment where I'm working, most things we try to automate as much as we can. We've had a couple national digital stewardship residency projects focused on integrating like more open source concepts into our automation and standardizing them. But captioning, because of the human involvement and the use of proprietary technologies, like has been one place where it's been a challenge to like integrate more, open source techniques. We're still using a software called MacCaption by Telestream to do the captioning cleanup. I've seen like when I've seen reviews of like more open projects, there'll usually be some type of issue that just kind of constrains us from considering it. Like I saw one tool for captioning cleanup and manipulation like didn't give any method to take like all the captions and shift them in time. So like for instance, if the program is re-edited to add 15 seconds onto the end and you have to like move all the timing down by 15 seconds, you don't want to do that with hundreds of captions if it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon and this is broadcast the next day. I feel like the sort of requirements that are met by our proprietary tools like would need to be better addressed by some of the open source options for us to like integrate them safely without causing us a lot of stress because of the timelines which often go with these accessibility issues.
Yeah, I'd also spec'd out use of MacCaption. The really like MacCaption was incredibly expensive. It's slightly less expensive, but it was used to be about $6,500 for a single license, which is not really feasible for most small archives or any size archives.
Yeah.
And for us, like basically all the functionality is geared towards broadcast, like geared towards embedding and creating transport streams, basically. But all we really needed.
I want to add that like MacCaption used to come with a big dongle you had to plug into your computer, and it had like a little badge on it that said there's like a reward if you send the dongle in. So we asked the support guy, and he said it's like usually $50 if you ever find one of these dongles.
Man, that could be a possible funding source. Yeah. But so that's like a ridiculous license to pay for when really our only functionality that we need is to pull out the embedded line 21 captions.
Yeah, it's still a bit ridiculous that like the tiniest part of our audiovisual content of the presentation is like the most complicated to like gain tools to work with. Like FFmpeg can do just about everything we need for audiovisual manipulation, but like the tiny like little caption stream that we have to present alongside it ends up having sometimes the most complicated workflows.
Yeah, so actually, one tool that a friend pointed me to was this was created by Brian Wheeler, who's a developer at Indiana University Bloomington, and this is just his weird Perl script that he made to basically create a WebVTT file from line 21 captions, and it's weird and works.
It's both.
It's both. It's Perl.
Thanks and question.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Questions?
So,
Open source tool gets you closest to IDEO that you get more contributors than they're not.
sorry, you're asking like what open source tools like I'd like to see more contribution to?
No, you said that they all have their drawbacks. So
Yeah.
I'm asking which one is closest to IDEO that you could get momentum behind it as contributors to adopt that instead of using something.
Yeah, I mean that's true, and I mean I shouldn't criticize that without admitting that this issue is kind of on me a bit too, as like a potential user. I remember in a previous job I was looking for software that would help facilitate ripping audio off DAT tapes with data drives, and like I found there was maybe 4 or 5 pieces of software, but they all had advantages over the other, so like it was difficult to select. But I ended up like writing the kind of gap analysis between them and sending it to the developers, and one was just like, okay, I fixed it, now it has all the advantages, and it was just really wonderful. And then we just kind of committed to and supported that software. Like, I feel like a similar effort might be really worthwhile to collaborate with on developers of these kind of open source utilities, because if we wanted to make these kind of tools more relevant to other types of environments where they're more used to using these kind of like expensive proprietary workflows.
Yeah, I would say one thing, like for any casual user, FFmpeg is not friendly, or there's a pretty steep learning curve. But so as someone who gradually has learned about captions, like Dave helped contribute to a filter to pull line 21 information out as like a hex dump or whatever. But I mean, getting to the world where there could be actual text output from FFmpeg would be great. I don't know what that would look like, just going from the world of actually translating the hex dump into time text metadata.
Yeah, this is FFmpeg now. It's just like a read EAI 608 filter. So you feed in video, it discovers what line the line 21 captions are on, just like those little blinky dots. And then it transforms them into like a hexadecimal representation, which is similar to SCC. So if you have like that old school like analog style captioning, like this is potentially one way to try to read it out into something that you can work with. Any more questions? I thought like Travis and Ashley were planning some questions. Like, you guys got them, or?
Look at that furious eyebrows. All right, thank you guys.
Thanks.